Have you ever started a project, gotten not even halfway through, let's say like a quarter of the way through, and immediately gone like, what on earth was I thinking? I am way in over my head. Imagine maybe that, your wife, she's standing out in the back and she's like, man, it'd be really nice to have a back patio out here. Maybe I can call some companies and see how much that would be. And you're like, babe, I got this. You don't need to call anyone. I will do it all by myself. I'm the man. I got this. And then you're like halfway through clearing just the grass. You're like, I do not got this. I do not got this. Maybe that's just me because I'm not particularly handy, but I think you get the idea. Well, something similar has happened to me in setting off on this project that I've undertaken, which started with making a video, A Protestant's Case for Catholicism. There's also going to be a Protestant's case for Orthodoxy, a Protestant case for Protestantism, but also rebutting the first two of those. I thought, going into it, I started with the Protestant's case for Catholicism, and I said, look, I know I'm going to make a rebuttal, but I refuse to artificially weaken this video. I will come up with the best 30-minute case I can think of for Catholicism, and then I'll just figure out how I'm going to argue against it. And so that's what I did. And I don't want to be self-congratulatory here, but I think I made a better argument than I thought I would. And so in sitting down to rebut this, I found, wow, this is more difficult than I thought. But true to my word, that is what I'm going to be doing today. I'll be making a rebuttal to my video, A Protestant's Case for Catholicism, in which I do a little outfit change and say, this is now Catholic Austin, and make the case. So that case had essentially 4 parts. I make an a priori argument for Catholicism based on the structure of Catholicism. I then move into a historical case for Catholicism, trying to show that what I had established in the a priori as reasonable is in fact playing out in history. Then I go into scripture, showing that, hey, it's not just logical, it's not just historical, but it's also biblical. And then I kind of make a little bit of a turn to the experiential side. I'm not going to touch on that too much because I think that is a bit more personal and going to be subjective, so it's a little harder to argue against. But in this response, I'll go through some of the key points of the argument. But something I want to flag before we even get going too far is something that I mentioned at the very beginning of the video. To be Catholic is not primarily to hold some ideology labeled as Catholic. To be Catholic is to be a member of the Holy Catholic Church founded by Jesus Christ himself. As such, this isn't a case for every Catholic doctrine, but for the identity of the Catholic Church being that very church Christ founded. Sorry to interrupt the video. I hope you're enjoying it, but I want to say videos like this project I've been undertaking, and really all the videos I make, take a lot of time. They take energy, resources, time to research, and it's only possible because of my patrons. So if you are in a position to do so, it would mean the world to me. If you consider supporting the channel on Patreon, you can go to patreon.com/gospelsimplicity. If you do so, you get all types of fun perks. At all levels, you get access to the Gospel Simplicity Book Club, as well as interviews early and ad-free, as well as some other perks. But at the higher levels, one of my favorite things to get to do is to talk with people who are kind of going through these questions, and we'll meet one-on-one, and I'll do my best to kind of point you to resources that could be helpful. And I've heard from people that that's helpful for them. So if you are interested, go to patreon.com/gospelsimplicity. All right. So this was an important turn that I took in the video very early on. And I was doing this intentionally because if I was a Catholic, this is how I would argue for it. What I'm doing though is a bit, it's going to be weird. Anytime I compliment that argument, it's complimenting myself. In any case, it's a way of kind of shrinking the target, right? And what I was consciously doing is saying, hey, this video isn't going to argue for every Catholic doctrine, because that opens you up to the rebuttal being able to kind of pull on any low-hanging fruit, like say the bodily assumption of Mary or any doctrine that you think isn't quite consistent. I was consciously saying, no, this is an argument for the identity of the Catholic Church being consistent with the one that Jesus founded. That's a more narrow claim, and to argue against it is going to be a bit more difficult. That's what I've found in making this rebuttal video. And so as tempting as it would be to try to argue against this case by throwing out all of these red herrings about, say, the bodily assumption or, unum sanctum or haec sancta, or all, niche kind of magisterial documents or matters of consistency, I don't think that's really fair because that's not what's being argued for here. So it's something worth flagging, though, is if you see me struggling to rebut this argument, I would say that's different from, not having any disagreements with the Catholic Church. But this argument specifically is saying, like, look, those aside, let's get down to the thing that really matters. And I don't think it's a dishonest move. I don't think it's like a sleazy apologetics move that's trying to, pull a fast one on you. I think it's similar to how you would argue for the inerrancy of Scripture, right? Because if you wanted to argue for the inerrancy of Scripture and someone was coming against you saying, like, okay, but what about, was it Satan or was it God that told David to take the census? Or was it, did the sun really stand still in Joshua? Or like these random kind of questions. You'd say, like, look, we're missing the point. We're going to start with, are the Scriptures inspired? And then we can reason from inspiration to inerrancy in that way. So I'm going to try to, I was trying to do something similar there. And so I wouldn't want to argue like an atheist who's kind of throwing out random things. So I'm going to try to stay focused on the video. But worth keeping in mind that I've, intentionally in the case, Catholic Austin has made a smaller target to aim at in the rebuttal. Let's move on a little bit though. This is going to get into the a priori case. And again, so a priori is like prior to experience, if you're not familiar with philosophy. So it's saying, hey, we're not going to look at empirical facts here. We're just going to ask armchair philosopher what would make sense given a few things that we know. And so in the video, I talk about, hey, we know that Christ wants his church to be united, Christ founded the church was point one. He intended the church to be united, and that unity includes doctrinal unity. The third point was really important for me to include in this case because I wanted to say, hey, it can't just be a vague unity, right? It can't just be like, hey, we're all getting along. It's like, no, we actually believe the same things. And I really harp on that as I make the case. But let's take a quick listen to see what was going on there. If you were to establish a church, which at the very least has institutional aspects, such as having leaders, and you wanted it to be united, including in doctrine, how would you go about that? Would you make it a free-for-all where anything goes? No, of course you wouldn't. You'd need structure so that worship can be done in a fitting and orderly way. And what kind of structure would that be? One would think it would have leaders to settle disputes. But what happens if these leaders disagree with one another? For unity to be maintained, and of course we want unity, including on doctrine, then you would need someone with a final say. You might... All right, so cut myself off there just a little bit, but what I was getting ready to say in the video was you might say that person's Jesus, and like fair enough in one sense, but he doesn't usually speak in direct and universally accessible ways, and so to structure the church, you would need someone who could kind of resolve these disputes. You need someone at the top, and that person sounds a lot like the Pope. Okay, so I think this argument's okay, and I don't think it's great, but that didn't keep me from putting it in, not because I wanted something to knock down, because I don't think it has to be great for the argument to function. Basically, what I would say, if I was going to critique this, is that having a church with a single head is a fine way to set it up. It's a reasonable way to do it, but certainly not the only one, right? I don't see in principle why we couldn't have a setup that, even striving for doctrinal unity and having leaders who disagree could not solve those things through like a synodal process, right? Or you could look at like a more Republican model where the people have a say, but they have a say through kind of choosing bishops, and those bishops would then vote, and whoever had the majority would win, or something like that. Like a priori, I don't see a problem with those, and I think the synodal way does have decent merit to it in terms of church history. Of course, that's kind of aside, right? Because we're just looking a priori. But the point is, while this is a reasonable way, I don't think it's the only reasonable way. I'll be really interested as an aside. The person who I'm getting this argument from was Dr. Joshua Sijuwadi, who kind of published this as a philosophical case for the papacy, but has recently become Orthodox. Now, I don't want to harp on that too much because, look, everyone has their own reasons for doing these things, and I don't think that would invalidate his argument. But it's just an interesting kind of point to bring up that when I made this, I was pulling on a Catholic philosopher who's now no longer Catholic. I have no idea, though, if it has to do with this video, or not this video, but this argument, rather. Suffice to say, okay, a priori case, it's okay. It doesn't prove it, but it doesn't need to either. It's just setting it up to say that this is reasonable. And on that point, I don't see any a priori reasons to say that it's not reasonable. So what's really going to matter then is to kind of get into the brass tacks of history. And to do that, we'll jump ahead a little bit in the video. where I make a couple distinctions about history and then get into some of the data. Here we go. Some clever Protestants will catch us if we say, history points to the Catholic Church being true. That's a tricky claim. History qua history can't really prove that. History can't tell us who was right about the eternal procession of the Holy Spirit, for instance. It would be better to say, the Catholic Church today means an organic continuity with the ancient church, both in structure and thought. So I won't stay on this too much, but I do think it's an important distinction here I'm making between church history, and historical theology that I think goes missing and causes people to make otherwise strong arguments weak by kind of overexerting the argument. So I don't think that we can say that history proves Catholicism any more than I think we can say that history proves that Jesus is God, right? Like that, it's somewhat of a category error. There are kind of historical considerations wrapped up in the Christian faith, but those don't kind of prove some of the philosophical or faith claims that are being made. So I was just kind of flagging this, and then I was trying to, again, narrow the target by saying, hey, I'm not even saying that the Catholic Church looks exactly the same, but it's an inorganic continuity, all of which I think is totally fair. To disprove that idea of organic continuity is also going to be a little difficult. We'd have to set parameters for what organic continuity looks like. Throughout this video, I'm going to use the idea of the trunk of a tree that kind of grows into a tree with many branches. And so we'd have to say that like the branches that grow from it are somehow essentially at odds with the trunk, right? So what's present in the trunk could not flower into those things without deforming itself, would be kind of the most strong argument against it. But we are also, as I go through history, going to be able to look at like, is the evidence put forth to say that, hey, what we made in the a priori case is reasonable? Does it align with the kind of historical data? So I think the historical data is going to be probably where I maybe have some disagreements as we kind of form a hypothesis for kind of reconstructing what the early church did and thought, which again is going to be a probabilistic judgment. It's not going to be a matter of like certainty. It's not something that we're going to be able to prove, but we are going to kind of engage in a historical reconstruction, which is what I do in this video. And I think there might be a couple points where I might quibble with this Catholic Austin, but let's go ahead and jump forward to see what some of those points are. Actually, we're going to make one more distinction. It's a really quick distinction, but it's going to be helpful on the idea of kind of probabilistic things. So I make this one little sentence here right after that says, for the sake of time, we'll assume that we're all on board with the concept of Nicene orthodoxy. I know. So that might seem like a kind of throwaway line, but it's not, because again, it's narrowing the target. It's saying like, hey, I'm not even kind of reconstructing from the data entirely that this is the case, but I'm saying, hey, if you're on board with Nicaea, that's going to be the trunk we're working with. We're going to move up from there. So I'm not even saying like we're going to go from the earliest times, even though the evidence I give starts before that to kind of get a sense of what's in that trunk. This is a internal consistency argument, which I think again is a stronger way of making it, but it's also going to be like less compelling. I think my takeaway, like for a lot of Catholic apologists, is they aim too big and they make too large of claims that allows you to kind of pull out weak points of the foundation. But this, I was trying to go really narrow, but go far with it. And as such, there's not so many claims being made, so it is a hard argument to rebut. It's something that I've struggled with. Okay, but with that being said, you could try to just say, hey, I'm not on board with Nicene orthodoxy. And, people have taken that line, like Dr. Stephen Nemesh, and I get comments occasionally that people are like, hey, you're wrong for assuming the church fathers have authority. And that's fair enough. Like that is a historical value judgment that goes above looking at just history qua history. Go back to that distinction I was making. But I do think that most people who watch my videos, and like myself specifically, I'm not looking to throw Nicene orthodoxy out the door. Like you're free to, I don't suggest you do, but like, no one is stopping you from doing that per se. And it is a specific strand of the Christian development. Like there were those who called themselves Christians that were obviously going in very different directions, and Arius wasn't crazy. But if we start to take those moves, we're really doing something quite radical. And we're kind of removing ourselves from the mainstream history of the church, lowercase c Catholic in that sense. Again, there's like, if you're a historian and you think that's the way to do it, that's fine. But I don't think you're really doing Christian theology at that point in the way we understand it. Again, that's not a truth claim, but it is a consistency claim, which I think, makes it a little more difficult. I do think, as an aside, like the consistency claim is why so many Catholics spend their time converting Protestants rather than atheists, because it's easier to convert a Protestant on an internal consistency argument, like, hey, you already accept these things, than it is to convert an atheist, because there's less common ground, and you'd have to argue for Nicaea, right? You'd have to argue for the existence of God. You have to do a lot more of the foundation work. Here, the Catholic apologist is starting several steps ahead. But finally, the historical data. I've been promising this for a while. The church is united, its unity must be visible. And to be united visibly, it needs some type of structure that maintains this unity. In the Catholic Church, that's the Pope. But when we investigate history, do we see the Pope acting in this way to maintain the unity of the church? Well, why, yes, we do. As early as the 1st century, Clement of Rome, the 4th Pope, writes to a church all the way out in Asia Minor, in Corinth, and weighs in on local disputes. This is a remarkable piece of evidence, showing that as early as the 1st century, the Bishop of Rome was acting to preserve unity in the church by nature of his authority in areas outside his local jurisdiction. Likewise, in the 2nd century, Pope St. Victor I involved himself in debates swirling in the East, instructing them to hold synods to resolve the issue of the date of Easter. He even went as far as to excommunicate churches in the East. And while many bishops disagreed with the prudence of this action, they didn't disagree that it was outside his authority. In the 3rd century, we see a consistent pattern that when disputes arose, the Bishop of Rome acted as the court of appeals. The cases range from disputes over the rightful bishop of Antioch, appealing the deposition of bishops in Spain, and weighing in on the orthodoxy of teachings popping up in Alexandria. And all of this is prior to the Council of Nicaea. What we see here then is that the trunk of the tree features a church acting in ways consistent with the a priori case we outlined above, as well as consistent with the Catholic claim that the Bishop of Rome is the first among equals and the servant of the servants of God. He has universal jurisdiction, and his decrees are binding. Okay, so this is kind of where we actually get into some claims. And I mean, for the record, I think all of these claims are true, right? Like, I'm not going to dispute them as points of fact that these things happen. But the key claim is that these things kind of get us to, or are consistent with the Catholic claim that the Bishop of Rome is the first among equals, the servant of the servants of God, and has universal jurisdiction, and his decrees are binding. Okay, so there's 4 things there. First among equals, I don't think is that difficult of a claim. I think, we don't necessarily see that in these because we don't see him interacting with as many. Well, I guess we don't see him interacting with like patriarchs here. So to try to say that he's first, when it comes to like Antioch, Alexandria, Jerusalem, etc., that might be a stretch, but fair enough. I think it's an easy point to concede if we add other things. Servant of the servants of God. I chose a very appealing title for the Pope, so I'm not going to kind of argue against that. But that his decrees, that his universal jurisdiction and his decrees are binding. Okay, so this gets into like something a little more, but even there, I'm showing kind of my theological cards. If I were to be Catholic, like his decrees are binding. Is it maybe fair way of describing infallibility? I happen to think infallibility is a very unhelpful term. Unhelpful insofar as I think that opens you up to a lot. The binding and irreformable are probably better ways of putting it, like, or at least that's how I would want to put it if I were Catholic. But the important thing to note here is that the goal of this argument was to say that what we outlined in the a priori case, that we need this person who has universal jurisdiction and binding authority, and that person is a singular person in the Pope, it was to say that we actually see this in history. And I think the facts are a little more complicated than that. I think it's generally true that from an early time, the Bishop of Rome had a self-conception of heightened authority. Now, whether that authority, looked exactly like Vatican I in their self-understanding, I'm not sure. I don't think it necessarily needs to be the case that it was like precisely defined given doctrinal development, which is something I talk about later in the video. But, Vatican I does claim that this is a doctrine that's, believed everywhere and by all, in all in all times, kind of using like the Vincentian canon, Vincent of Lerins. And where I think this argument begins to fall short is that when we look at the East, I don't think that we see that the Pope's self-understanding was the Church's understanding of the Bishop of Rome. It's worth zooming out for a second. We talk about the East versus the West in these times, but the Bishop of Rome is kind of alone in the West, and then we have 4 patriarchs in the East. The center of gravity in the Church is really in the East at this time. That's where we get the Cappadocians. That's where we get the Alexandrian school. That's where we get the Antiochian school. Like a lot of what's going on is going on there. And especially after the capital moves away from Rome, like Rome becomes kind of a backwater that's working against, Arian invaders, and it's kind of on its own. And it does seem naturally that it would, see that its jurisdiction feels pretty big because it's the only one over there, versus in the East, you have kind of more balance of power because you have more patriarchates. And I think one way that we kind of see this come out is in the ecumenical councils. Again, at this point in the video, I'm arguing that, hey, how is the Church acting? Is it acting in accordance with this? But the ecumenical councils give us insight into something of a different picture, specifically when we look at the canons of those councils. So if we start with the first council at Nicaea, in Canon 6, we have seemingly the Bishop of Alexandria and the Bishop of Rome being put on equal footing. Now, this is an interpretive question, as everything is an interpretive question. But the canon reads, "Let the ancient customs in Egypt, Libya, and the Pentapolis prevail, that the Bishop of Alexandria have jurisdiction in all these, since like is customary for the Bishop of Rome also." What this seems to be doing is setting up kind of like a regional jurisdiction for the Bishop of Alexandria, developing something like the patriarchates, right? I was about to say patriarchy, which I guess would be fair. Anyway, so we're seeing kind of like a regional jurisdiction that's heightened compared to, a bishop of just a singular city. And it's saying that that's how it is in Rome and that's how it is in Alexandria. But it does seem to imply that like Rome's jurisdiction isn't everywhere either. Otherwise, the analogy would be that the Bishop of Alexandria's jurisdiction would be likewise everywhere. It seems to be that they think, yeah, Rome has, a heightened jurisdiction compared to a regular bishop, but it's in its region. And to kind of play this out, we see this affirmed, I think, at the next ecumenical council in 381 in Constantinople. There, it's Canon 2, we have, "The bishops are not to go beyond their dioceses to churches lying outside of their bounds, nor bring confusion on the churches. It is evident that the synod of every province will administer the affairs of that particular province as was decreed at Nicaea." So here we have both kind of a synodal way, rather than an image of more like a monarchical setup. But we also have the idea of, hey, don't go judging cases outside your bounds. I think for a Catholic, they have to read into this the idea of like, yeah, it's subsidiarity, but ultimately at the top of that was the Bishop of Rome. But the canon doesn't provide for that. It seems to be more that like, no, we just have this idea of regional synodal authority. And at times we could say, between these two councils, we have the Council of Sardica, where there's kind of like an appellate jurisdiction for Rome, but that isn't the same as Rome being able to like immediately involve itself in all of these and its jurisdiction automatically extending outside of its kind of regional boundaries. So what it seems to suggest here again at Constantinople is regional authority versus universal authority, which would contradict the claim of Vatican I and the general case that I've made in the video for the Pope having universal jurisdiction. Then kind of another ecumenical council, just a little ways on in 451, we have yet another canon, which is Canon 28, which raises Constantinople to be New Rome. And critically, it says that Rome's authority was based on its kind of like geopolitical situation. It reads, "For the fathers rightly granted privileges to the throne of old Rome because it was the royal city." Now, I don't get into this in the video, but the claim of Vatican I is that it's not, that the Bishop of Rome does not have his authority based on anything other than the will of God, right? Like this isn't kind of a geopolitical thing. This is saying, no, Christ established a church that was founded upon Peter and the apostles. He gave Peter the keys to the kingdom, which was the instantiation of the papacy. The papacy is by divine will, not by like the will of man or kind of the accidents of history. But here, the council fathers seem to be declaring that no, like Rome had its status because it was the imperial city, not for some kind of theological reason. And that's not to say that they didn't, maybe think there were theological aspects to Rome, but at least in the canons, that's not what we're given. And the raising of Constantinople to that status is really significant as well to our questions of, is the Pope above the other patriarchates? So the kind of summary that I would say for this point is that while the Church in the West does seem to give us historical precedent for reconstructing something like a papal office, the Church as a whole doesn't seem to do that. It seems that when we look at it, especially exercising its authority in its most profound moments, right, at the ecumenical councils, it seems to give us a different picture that doesn't quite align with the self-understanding of the Bishop of Rome. And it's worth saying that the Bishop of Rome didn't like all of these canons, didn't always interpret them the same way. In fact, the Council of Constantinople, he wasn't even invited to, he wasn't at. There were no papal legates there, which brings up all different types of questions about kind of the authority of ecumenical councils. That council wasn't seen as ecumenical until it was received. It wasn't seen as ecumenical in the West for a couple hundred years after that, which does bring into why maybe there were changes to the creed and such. But it was a local council. Well, it was not local council. It was a council that was kind of limited to the East, that was much smaller than Nicaea. But again, that does give us something of the Church's self-understanding that they felt like they could have a pretty important council without having the Bishop of Rome there at all. Again, to summarize, while the Bishop of Rome might have thought he had something like the papal office, I'm not sure that the Church in the East thought the same thing, which would undermine the claim that this has been kind of the universal teaching of the Church throughout all times and places. Let's look ahead a little more, though, as we get into what I think was an important part of the video, where I moved from how the Church acted to how the Church thought, which is getting into historical theology. I go through the 4 marks of the Church. That's 1, Holy, Catholic, and Apostolic. Again, I think I've held up 5 fingers there. 1, Holy, Catholic, and Apostolic, which relates back to Nicaea. And I think I have something of a strong moment in the video where I talk about the importance of apostolic succession. So we will jump to that now. If we're trying to go back to the trunk looks like a church that sees ecclesial validity being contingent upon apostolicity, both in doctrine and succession. Thus, okay, it's really hard to do this without cutting myself off. That's the end of an argument where I'm saying, look, the reformers are making a case that we can separate apostolic doctrine from apostolic succession. And I'm making an argument that that's incoherent because part of the apostolic doctrine is the succession of apostles by in the bishops through time, and that's how we kind of have priestly validity. So this is a tricky one in which my thoughts, Protestant Austin's thoughts, have developed over time. It's not what I want to be true, because if we're going to kind of decide where the Church is based on where validly ordained ministers are, specifically those with apostolic succession, it does limit the Church in a much more narrow sense than I typically want to. Like, my inclination is to want to have as big of a tent as possible, right? But I do think that the more I've looked at it, if we want to make a distinction between the apostles and the very early Church, we can do that and say, well, it's not in the apostles. Even that, I think, is tenuous. But if we want to in any way reclaim the doctrine of the very early Church, I think it's really difficult to say that apostolic succession isn't seen as a necessary part of being the Church. Now, I've had Gavin Ortland on. I've had him in this house, right below me here. And we discussed this, and he goes through why he doesn't think that what Clement and Irenaeus are talking about is exactly the same as what's being declared today about apostolic succession. And on the one hand, I'd say fair enough, but on the other hand, I'd say they're a whole lot closer to going for that than kind of alternative models are that I think pop up at the Reformation. And I think, if we allow for a touch of doctrinal development there, it doesn't take a lot to get from Clement or Irenaeus to something today. The other option is to say that this was merely a functional concept, right? So it's not from the apostles, it comes right after them, though, and the Church uses this as a way to kind of preserve unity, but it's only a means to an end. It's not an end in itself. We can go there. I don't find that argument particularly compelling, though, just because of the way that the early church is talking about this and the self-understanding of the church for centuries. Like, this has been such a critical part. And I do think we run the risk of really redefining apostolicity if it doesn't include apostolic succession. So I guess in part, I'm just saying I would mainly grant this argument. There's a few kind of ways to wiggle around it. But with that being said, even if I grant the argument, it's not, therefore Catholicism is true, which I don't think Catholic Austin would say, right? I mean, he was making a argument that required each of these parts, right? It's what's the word when you add a bunch of stuff together? I don't know. It's aggregate's not the word I was looking for, but it is an aggregate of all of the arguments here, right? So yes, you can grant this, and you could be an Anglican, you could be like a Swedish Lutheran, you could be Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox, Oriental Orthodox, you could be Catholic, right? It's just kind of one part of the puzzle, but it does end up lopping off some other options. Now, even if you do that, I will say the question of, what's the essence of the church, whether apostolic succession is necessary, is a different question from, who is saved. And I do want to keep that as broad as possible. But yeah, okay, so let's go on a little further, in which case I make a bit of a rhetorical argument about what it is to reform the church. Here we go. First, I find it a bit frustrating when Protestants will say they're reforming the church, but the church they seem to want to recreate never once existed prior to the 16th century. They'll say that they're appealing to history to overturn the accretions that built up in the Catholic Church. But if they're to do this consistently, one would think that there's some pristine period of the church where we can go back to if what we're really doing is reforming and not restarting the church. So, basically this argument is claiming that for a reform to be consistent, it must have something to go back to, right? So if the Protestants are saying, hey, we want to go back to the 4th century, we would expect in the 4th century to find a church that looks very Protestant. And Catholic Austin is making the claim that's not what you're going to find. And if you don't find it, then are you going to go back further? Are you going to say the church died immediately? What are you going to do here? This argument, I think is maybe persuasive one in terms of the rhetoric, but the claims themselves, I'm not being super specific in the video, but I think there's room for concern, right? Because we could say well, maybe, we'd have to get at what is the substance of the church in these periods, and maybe that does align. But even more so, I think the way I would try to argue against this argument is that reform doesn't require merely going back. It allows for a vision of the church in which we are kind of using the past to also spring forward, because you might be kind of scraping off the accretions or scraping off the barnacles of the ship, but you're also trying to make the church more fully what she ought to be, which might be something that's only ever ahead of the church. There's different ways of conceiving of this, right? That we could say the church was most pure, and then it's been a slow decline away from that. But that seems theologically problematic if the church is just always getting worse. I think what we'd want to say is that the Spirit is continually active in the church, such that the church is seeking to ever be more fully and faithfully what she ought to be. I've often talked about the church as a sacrament, and it's the sign of Christ's presence in the world. And in that way, the sign can always be clearer, always be more compelling, and always be better, right? And I think the Reformation even had something of this consciousness with the idea of semper reformanda, that the church is always reforming. Now, they might have thought that they were always going back to something better, but I think I would want to say, the church is actually always trajecting towards something better. And I don't think this is a defeater for Catholicism, because I think, Catholic theology certainly has elements of this in it, but I do think it kind of tames the rhetoric that's going on here of, well, where is your church prior to it? Because that church might always be out ahead of us. But that's just kind of one point of the argument. Let's go a little further forward. I'm going to jump to about the 20-minute mark, where I have another kind of point about doctrinal development and how the church of the past relates to the church of the present. Here we go. Oh, if Christ established a church, and he did, and that church has authority, which it does, then what do? It's a noble goal to say we reform it to its more pure form. But when you try to do that, you'll just find the same Catholic Church at an earlier point in its natural development. It's like seeing a flower sprout, and at the top, it blooms with colors you didn't expect. So you cut it down to the stem, which feels more familiar, feels more safe. But just wait, the same flower will bloom. And if you're still not a fan of the bloom, feel free to uproot the whole thing. Just don't call it reform, or in this case, pruning. Call it what it is. Demolition. Having seen... Okay, I thought that was a fun turn of phrase when I was making it. This argument, again, it's like evocative of something, right? Where we have this image of natural organic growth and being like, whoa, why did this flower bloom yellow? I thought it was going to bloom orange based on the stem. And then you cut it back to say, okay, now I'm comfortable with the stem, but it's just inevitably going to go there. Why I would say like this is interesting, it's not an argument that can really be proven, right? We can't know if the church, if you reformed it back, is it always going to end up another way? We're kind of in the realm of counterfactuals here because we can't go back to 1516, right? And have Luther never in 1517 nail up his 95 Theses. We don't know, but my general inclination is that history, and including the history of the church being wrapped up in history, is full of like contingencies and accidents, not in the terms of like oopsies, but in the terms of like, hey, substance accidents distinction, right? That things just happened certain ways. That doesn't mean that God's not providentially guiding them, right? But it's to say that like we can't know whether things would have been different. And so to make the argument that, the Catholic Church will always develop in this direction just seems to be a bit overplaying the cards. And so while this argument, might have sounded good, I do think it is in danger of protesting too much. So as I move into the scriptural arguments, I make the idea that like, look, we're not going to kind of prove beyond a shadow of a doubt in scripture how you should set up the church, and that is the Catholic Church. In fact, I say that, what we're instead going to do is again, just show that this is reasonable, which I think is the right way to argue for these things. It makes it hard to argue against it because I do think Catholicism is reasonable. Therefore, like, what am I supposed to rebut here? But I am making a couple of specific claims, even though, again, this video often is slippery because it doesn't make a whole lot of like hard and fast claims. But there is one that's kind of important here. It's a minor one and one I might even grant, but worth flagging. Throughout church history, it's been nearly universally attested that the Bishop of Rome has a special relationship to Peter as his successor in a unique way. So that might seem like a just small point, and it's actually not necessarily about scripture, but it's really important because I'm going to throw out a bunch of scriptures in this and what follows about Peter. But for them to be at all relevant to the discussion, we have to make this link between Peter and the Bishop of Rome. Now, that's certainly something that's happened a lot and something that got solidified in the West fairly early on, but it's also worth just flagging for a moment that there are counterclaims that regard, all the bishops as sitting in the seat of Peter, that all bishops are Petrine in this way. I think we can see Cyprian making claims to this extent. I think we can see it in some other places as well. I think Origen has a little bit on this, and it gets into kind of how Matthew 16:18 is interpreted throughout history, which isn't universally attributed to Peter, but in a lot of cases they're saying like there's all the bishops are Peter. Again, that's not universal either, but it's enough to say that, hey, we have to be careful that we can automatically move from a passage about Peter to the successors of Peter. That's something that has to be proven, or at least argued for. Maybe proven's not the right word. It has to be established in some way, and I don't do it in this video. So I would say that does kind of add a little hint of doubt to the things that I'm throwing in here, because we can say all of the amazing things about Peter we want, but we have to have some mechanism for then applying that to all of the bishops of Rome. And I think that's a little harder to do. Not impossible, but it's often something that doesn't get done in apologetics, which I think is unfortunate. But honestly, from there, I go into experience a little bit. I talk about, hey, like all of this aside, the point is to get to the Eucharist. And where can we be assured there's the Eucharist? It seems like we can have that where the bishops are in succession and the they're bound together, united, and that principle of unity is the Pope. And so you can have that source and summit of the Catholic faith at any church which is in union with Peter. And wouldn't you want that? And like, emotionally, I think that, that pulls on my heartstrings, and I get it. But I think, I won't touch too much on that last section again, because it's about experience. I get into Eucharistic miracles, which I just threw them in because like they shouldn't be written off prima facie. I also recognize that they don't really convince non-Catholics, but that's fine. So where does that leave us? We're 40 minutes into this rebuttal, and you're probably thinking like, where's the knockdown argument, Austin? Protestant Austin, you promised you'd rebut this. I don't know that I have a knockdown. This is actually my second time recording this video, because the first time I recorded it, I was even more dejected at the end. And I was like, I can't publish that. It's terrible. But even though I'm a bit, I've slept on it and tried again, I do think that the key thing in understanding this is that the video is a little short on concrete claims. It doesn't give you a lot to rebut. It mainly argues that Catholicism is reasonable, and that's a point I want to concede. I've kind of always, not always, but since looking into these things, found Catholicism to be reasonable, to find it, I find it to be prima facie, like really appealing. I get caught up in the particulars, but I do think it's worth asking, like, are those particulars essential? And can we consistently apply the methodology that we use to undermine those principles, to those particulars, to our own ecclesiologies, right? I think Protestantism often kind of dodges this by saying like Protestantism itself is a movement, not a particular church, and that they don't claim infallibility. And that's fine. And I mean, it's fine. I'm going to probably take a similar line in my argument for it. But again, if we wanted to get to a more concrete claim like the inerrancy of the Bible, I do think we run into some of these difficulties. Now, don't cancel me for this, please. I find both biblical inerrancy and papal infallibility to be somewhat unhelpful concepts, because they use the empirical language for claims that I don't think can be empirically verified, and then allow you to make counter arguments that I don't think are necessarily appropriate to the nature of the claim properly understood. So I take biblical inerrancy to be, in practice, more of a claim about what attitude are you going to take towards Scripture. It's become, kind of like this shibboleth, or this gatekeeping word, like, do you affirm it? Not because I think the particulars are so important, but because I think it's really a question of, hey, when your reason comes up against something in Scripture that you don't understand, are you going to kind of use your own personal experience as the foundation to your theologizing, or are you going to use Scripture as the foundation? And when people affirm something like inerrancy, I think they're putting their foot down on the side of like, no, the Bible is going to be the authority. I think in a similar way, like in practice, papal infallibility works that way. And it's not so much like the empirical nature of the claim, because it's so hard to apply. Like, what do we even mean by it? And it's not even technically papal infallibility. It's the infallible magisterium of the Pope being exercised in certain situations, and which situations they are is anyone's best guess. Really, like it's hard to apply. And so it becomes, I think, less of like a, empirical question and more of a, what kind of attitude you're going to have when the Pope makes a ruling. Are you going to say, like, you're right, and I'm going to bend to that? I wish we just defined things those ways. I think it would be much easier. But alas, we don't, and maybe I'm just a terrible liberal for even thinking either of those things. Anyway, this is the point of the video where I start rambling and admit that this was not a very good rebuttal video. I don't know, a Catholic Austin guy's okay. I promised to do this, though, and I'm not going to film a third one of these. So, I don't know, maybe you've watched me suffer in this. I tried my best, and you guys probably enjoy watching me suffer. So, you're welcome.